12 years. I think one of the words I picked up in those years is insufferable. Some of these people are insufferable. You need to control yourself not to explode. So shallow, so egocentric, so wrong, but they think they know everything, broadcast their ignorance all over the place. We don't take kindly to arrogance. The plan will be implemented according to schedule. You are lecturing me what to do in Uganda. Advisors who commands me to do this, do that, and put through the East African pipeline and the refinery. We shall build a refinery at Hoima. I did not support the idea of a pipeline because I asked my Total friends, where are you taking our petrol? Pipeline for what? Here in East Africa, we have got energy needs. Why don't you build a refinery and we supply ourselves? That was my preference. Then they said, no.
Today I wanted to talk about Turkana oil. Whatever happened to that oil? Because at some point in the past, we were very excited in Kenya when they announced that Kenya has discovered oil, significant reserves of oil. And everyone was like, we are rich. People didn't believe because for a long time, there's been rumors that we have oil in Kenya, but nothing came of those rumors. So people are very skeptical when they are told that there's actual oil in Kenya. And then it turns out that it was actually true, that even Kenya has exported 200,000 barrels of oil. So it's actually true there is oil in Kenya, in a place called Turkana County. Now, over the past few years, that story has just disappeared. And many people are wondering, whatever happened to Kenya's oil? And this question is coming up because of the incredibly, high petrol prices. Yet we have oil. So if it's true that we have oil and the oil is mineable, how can it be that it's not being produced? What happened? Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Several issues with the oil production in Kenya. One of the major issues is who owns the oil that is under the ground in Kenya. Well, this oil is owned by the British, by the Canadians, and by the French. So the idea, the government sold them the oil block, right? Because they are very stringent policies as to who can buy an oil block. And some of the people who are not allowed to buy oil blocks are Kenyans. Okay, if you're an ordinary Kenyan and you want to start an oil production company, no one is selling you any oil block because, the policy is always pro-foreigner, okay? Those are the policies that are pursued by the various governments of Kenya. So they sell the oil blocks to the Europeans and the Canadians. So it's now their oil. So what happens is that the government is supposed to receive a royalty anytime they sell the oil. And the royalty is usually petty, maybe 5% of the value of the oil. So the situation is this: God has given us the oil, 100% of it. So the government shows up and gives that oil to the foreigners and gets 5% of the value of the oil. So 95% is kept by the foreigners. That's one of the biggest problems that we have. Now, beyond that, now that the oil is now owned by the foreigners, this was the plan. The plan, what the foreigners said, they said, we want to mine the oil and pump it out and then take it to the coast and sell it abroad. Think about that. Does that make sense to you? But does it make sense that we would sell oil, yet we need oil products? But this is always the policy of the government in Kenya. The policy is always the same. The country sells raw materials and imports finished products. So in the case of oil, it's the same situation whereby the Europeans who own the oil sell the oil abroad as raw material, as oil, crude oil. And then they import refined petroleum products like, petrol, diesel, etc. So we sell raw materials, we import finished products. There is no value addition to be done in Kenya. Do you see? So what they wanted to do, they wanted to build a pipeline from Turkana to Mombasa so that they can quickly extract and push out the oil. And so at the end of the life of the oil wells, what would happen is that we would be left with holes in the ground and 5% of the revenue of crude oil. And the Europeans and the Canadians who own the oil would make away with 95. And the Europeans and the Canadians who own the oil would make away with 95% of the revenue. The discussion of why Africa can never become rich, despite the vast resources that are found within Africa, usually is a function of the intellectual capacity of the various Africans who are in charge of these countries. And now I want to think the number of people who work in government. Here we are not really discussing necessarily the politicians. The politicians, yes, are a part of it, but I want you to think of the size of government, from the legislative arm of government to the executive, also to the ministries. In Kenya, they had a ministry of oil or something like that. And it's a whole ministry. They have a huge building, a brand new building, very fancy. And in that building, there are lots of people. So this decision to hand over the oil well to the Europeans and the Canadians is a decision that has been made by very many Africans. I want you to understand, it's not a single African making this decision. It's many Africans. So I want you to think the number of people involved in making this decision and how bad the decision is. Think about that. Think that these Africans, from the parliament, legislative arm, the executive of the country, the rulers of the country, and also the ministry in charge of the oil, all these people are agreeing that the oil should be extracted, okay, and exported as crude oil. Now, is that the best decision that could be made? Now, a better decision would be extract the oil, right, and then refine it in Turkana and sell into our market the refined products and keep all the profits right here in Kenya. So all these people involved in making decisions about this oil agreed that no refinery should be built in Kenya, that the oil should be exported in the rawest form, zero value addition. They didn't even say open up a refinery and then let us sell petrol, diesel, paraffin. No. They agreed with the Mzungu that no production facilities should be allowed in Kenya. Just dig holes in the ground, extract the oil, and send it to a foreign factory. The refinery is a factory, right? And that foreign factory where the crude oil is being sent has jobs, many jobs, yet we need those jobs in Kenya. So send our oil to a foreign factory and then have that factory sell us finished products. Are you understanding the issue? Can you see how the level of intellectual depravity the rulers of the country have? That for some reason, all these people are not able to use their brains. Or if they're able to use their brains, something has to be seriously wrong with their brains. Because if the idea is to create employment in Kenya, would you not want the refinery, a factory, to be built in Kenya? So why would you send your oil to a foreign refinery, create jobs for foreigners, who then sell you your own oil at an additional price? It's your own oil that you're buying back at a higher cost. Yet you could have refined it and sold it to your own self and keep the profits either way. Now, once the government agreed with the Mzungu that the oil is to be exported in the rawest form possible, what that meant was that they had to build a pipeline, because if you use trucks to transport that oil all the way to Mombasa, they said it's going to be very expensive. I don't believe that. The effect of using trucks to take the oil to Mombasa would mean you're creating a lot of jobs for the trucking companies and for Kenyans. And so they did not want that. So they said it's better for them, not for us. You have to understand, the Mzungu said it's better if a pipeline is built from Turkana to Mombasa, through which you're going to export the oil. Now, the problem is this. The oil that was found in Kenya has a very high, what they call a wax content, which means it's almost solid. So to pump an almost solid material through a pipeline is difficult. So you'd have to heat it to a certain degree so that it can become fluid so that you can pump it. So this is a heated oil pipeline. Now that is very expensive. What that means is that by the time the oil is getting to Mombasa to be exported, the cost of pumping it all the way to Mombasa will eat up a huge amount of the profitability of that oil. So in other words, it's a bad idea. You wouldn't want to do that. But the government, which doesn't act in our best interests, immediately agreed with what the Mzungu was saying. So they said they're going to build a pipeline from Turkana to Mombasa. And the only reason why that pipeline hasn't been built is because Uganda pulled out of it. Now, you need to understand there's also context because Uganda also has oil. And the same Mzungu, the same Europeans who control the oil in Turkana also control the oil in Uganda because the government of Uganda handed over all the oil wells to the foreigners. This is typical behavior by African men. Whatever God gives them, they give it to the Mzungu. Okay, fine. So they gave it to the Europeans. So the Europeans said the same thing, that they will pump the oil out of Uganda, build a pipeline to the coast, and extract the oil that way. And Uganda government will get 5% of the royalties, and the Europeans will get to keep 95% of the royalties. So, if the earlier clip that I showed, if you go watch all of it, Museveni, who is the president of Uganda, was talking about this, and he was explaining, and I really appreciated that. He explained what happens behind the scenes. So he was explaining his conversations with the Europeans to whom he handed over Uganda oil, and he said that they told him that's exactly what they'll do. They'll drill the oil, pump it to the coast, and that's it. But he didn't want his oil to be pumped to the coast. What he wanted was a refinery to be built right there where the oil is, and then Uganda could be selling finished petroleum products to the region. For him, that would make sense. But the Mzungu said no. There's no factories in Africa, no refinery in Africa. And so he struggled. He says he struggled with that decision. And he still is of the opinion that there should be refining capacity in Uganda. And if there was refining capacity in Uganda, maybe Kenya, which just discovered its own oil, could send its own oil to Uganda to be refined, and that refinery in Uganda would supply the whole region. But as you very well know, once the oil was discovered in Kenya, the government that is in Nairobi handed over the oil, of course, to the Europeans, who also said they want to pump it straight to the coast. And they would not consider it sending to any refinery within Africa, because the policy is no factories in Africa. Okay, we are supposed to supply raw materials only. And so that did not sit well with the government of Uganda under Museveni. But nevertheless, he agreed for the oil to be pumped to the coast. Now, the initial argument was the pipeline should, at least Kenya was lobbying for the pipeline to pass through Kenya in order to make it convenient for the Europeans in Kenya who own the oil to be able to pump it to the coast. So the oil pipeline wasn't for our benefit, strictly for the benefit of the foreigners who control the oil. Because, like I always say and remind you, that every decision that is made by the government in Kenya, regardless of who is in charge of the government, it makes no difference. Whatever decision they make in government is strictly for the benefit of foreigners. If there's conflict between our local interests and the foreign interest always wins 100% of the time. So the government that is in Nairobi at that time was campaigning or lobbying the government of Uganda to make sure that the oil pipeline passes through Kenya for the convenience of the European companies that control the oil in Kenya, so that they don't have to spend much money building a whole new pipeline in Kenya. Okay, so everything is being done for their convenience. But of course, for very many reasons, that pipeline is not going to be built in Kenya, and we won't discuss that. All I wanted to focus on is for you to understand what happens to African resources that are discovered in Africa. The African men immediately hand over those resources to foreigners immediately, and they make every decision for the benefit of foreigners, so the local people never win. Okay, and in the clip, if you also saw the whole clip, if you go and look for it online and watch all of it, there's another issue that came up, and I wanted to talk about that issue. Now, President Museveni of Uganda says that he received a letter and a phone call from the Europeans, and they instructed him not to sell or to develop the oil field. They told him, shut down the oil fields. Why? Because that's the decision they've made. And so when you see that clip, Museveni is complaining and he's not impressed by what the Europeans are telling him. And he calls them out on their incredible arrogance and the fact that they truly do believe that Africans are their slaves, because many times Africans behave like slaves towards them. But in this case, the president of Uganda, much credit to him, exposed all this information. And he said Uganda will continue to develop its own oil resources. And in fact, the Speaker of Uganda Parliament also gave a speech exposing that same letter that they had received from Europe, instructing them to shut down Uganda's oil fields and to make sure that they don't develop the oil sector for Uganda. Now, that's what happened in Uganda. Now, just the other day, you may not know this, in Zimbabwe, huge amounts of natural gas have been discovered. And this will give the Zimbabwe economy some kind of lifeline. Now, we already know the process that happens to African resources. The Africans in charge hand them over to foreigners. So even in the case of Uganda, in the case of Zimbabwe, the government of Zimbabwe has handed over 100% control of the natural gas to foreign companies, to foreigners, okay? Now, immediately that discovery was made, the government of Zimbabwe received instructions from the government of the United States. They were told, we forbid you to develop or try to sell the natural gas. These are the instructions coming from, the West, our pink master, Now, the government of Zimbabwe immediately said that they will continue to develop the oil and the oil sector, the natural gas sector, because they're already under sanctions, right? So nothing more can be done towards them that hasn't been done to them. Now, in the case of Kenya, I'm just giving you all these stories so that you can see a pattern of behavior by the Mzungu, Now, in the case of Kenya, the government that is in Nairobi was also given instructions to abandon oil production in Kenya. Now, the difference between the government that is in Nairobi and the government that is in Kampala and the government that is in Zimbabwe, in Harare, the difference is this. The government in Harare, the government in Kampala, once they received the instructions from the Mzungu, they immediately, in a manner of speaking, they gave the Mzungu the middle finger. Now, when it came to Kenya, once they received the same instructions to abandon oil production, they immediately obeyed. This is the reason why you never hear anything about Kenya's oil. Now, you may not know many things about Kenya's oil, but it is estimated that there are 560 million barrels of oil in Turkana. These are proven. This is not guesswork. And at 80,000 barrels per day in terms of production, that oil that is in Turkana can survive 19 years. And if the government was to build a factory refining that oil, it could supply Kenya with petroleum products, and it would lower our import bill and push up the living standards by reducing the cost of transport, because the increase of price in petroleum products is really driving up price inflation in Kenya, and it's effectively eroding incomes for Kenyans. Now, under any free government, what would happen is that the state itself would invite Kenyans, would form a company. This is what I would propose. Form a company that is a refining company, and then calculate the amount of money you need to invest in a refinery in Turkana, and then invite Kenyans to buy shares in that company. And that way we'll raise the capital. And then we buy the equipment, we hire the people, and we open up a refinery in Turkana, so that when we dig up the oil, we refine it and sell to ourselves the petroleum products. This is what any normal economy would work. Now, that is not going to happen in Kenya, because the government is under instructions by the Mzungu not to develop the oil industry. And the government doesn't like it when Africans or Kenyans own companies that produce anything. Okay, so they would never offer us an opportunity to own shares in a refining company, because the raw material is there. So this is the tragedy of a country like Kenya. So that's why I always tell you people, when you look around you and you see the incredible poverty, the absolute outrageous poverty, and you wonder, why is the country so poor? Why is everyone so poor? Why? This is the result of deliberate policy by the successive governments of Kenya. The elite that rules Kenya doesn't rule Kenya in the interests of you. They rule Kenya strictly in the interest of foreigners. Every day they wake up and they ask, what has the Mzungu said? Whatever the Mzungu has said for that day, that becomes the policy of the government. And the situation is so bad. Anytime you see your politicians going to give speeches at the United Nations, I want you to understand that that speech is not written by Kenyans. That speech is given to them by the West, by London or Washington. And they are told, you will say A, B, C, D. So if the Mzungu is saying, you will talk about climate change, they go and talk about climate change. It doesn't matter what it is. They are told what to say and they say it. So because you need to understand the history of the elite that has ruled Kenya. These are the descendants of the Home Guards. And by the 1960s, for you to become a member of the elite, when the British were getting ready to hand over independence, the requirement at that time was that all elite members should join British Freemasonry and they must join Western intelligence agencies. So that when Kenya was becoming independent, all those politicians that you're told are heroes, all of them were Masons and all of them belonged to either the CIA or British intelligence as agents, as people, as informants. So we had entire cabinets. Our entire cabinet was full of people who were informants for the CIA and the British intelligence, and they're all Masons. And it is this elite that continues to rule Kenya with almost no change. It's the same families, isn't it? Even the names that you don't know, the names that you don't think are famous, it's the same families, and the tradition continues of serving foreigners. This is the reason why we will never become rich.